There is a ceramic bowl sitting in a storage archive in Cairo. It is brown. It is chipped along the rim. It is roughly the size of a cereal bowl, and if you walked past it in a museum, you would not stop. You would not even slow down. Most people walk right past it. But hidden inside the residue coating the bottom of that bowl is something that shouldn't exist. A chemical trace, a molecular fingerprint, one that has no business being inside a 2,600-year-old Egyptian embalming vessel. Because the substance that left that trace didn't come from Egypt. It didn't come from the Mediterranean. It didn't even come from Africa. It came from a tropical rainforest in Southeast Asia. And that single finding, confirmed by gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis and published in Nature in February of 2023, doesn't just rewrite what we know about mummification. It rewrites what we know about the ancient world itself. If you find this kind of hidden history worth watching, hit subscribe. We are just getting started. The story begins underground, specifically about 6 meters underground, a few feet south of the Pyramid of King Unas at Saqqara, one of the oldest pyramid complexes in Egypt, located roughly 25 kilometers south of Cairo. Saqqara is not new territory. Archaeologists have been working there for more than a century. The site is vast, layered. There is always something left to find. But what a joint team from Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, the University of Tübingen, the National Research Center in Cairo, and the University of York found inside shaft M23. That was not something anyone was prepared for. Not a metaphor, not a myth, a physical cache. 121 ceramic vessels, bowls, beakers, and jars, stacked and stored inside a burial shaft that had been sealed for roughly 2,600 years. The shaft itself is labeled in the excavation records as belonging to the 26th dynasty period. That is 664 to 525 BCE. The era Egyptologists call the late period, when Egypt had already been conquered and reconquered, and stood at the edge of its last native flowering before foreign rule became permanent. These were not the pyramid builders. These were their inheritors. And what they left behind in shaft M23, was not a tomb offering. It was not a religious deposit. It was a workshop kit, a chemistry set, a professional embalmer's toolkit, packed, cataloged, and abandoned underground, as if someone expected to come back for it. They never did. The vessels were not blank. That is the first thing you need to understand. These jars were labeled, not with decorative hieroglyphs, not with prayers or dedications to Osiris. They were labeled in hieratic and demotic script, the practical shorthand writing systems that ancient Egyptians used for everyday documents, tax records, accounting, medicine. The labels on these jars read like instructions, like a pharmacist's notation, like a surgeon's kit. Some said things like, to put on his head. Some said, bandage or embalm with it. Some bore the names of the substances inside. Substances that scholars thought they had already identified, translated, and filed away in textbooks centuries ago. Here is where it gets strange. For generations, for more than 100 years of Egyptology, scholars translated a specific ancient Egyptian word, antiu, as either myrrh or incense. The word appears in religious texts. It appears in offering lists. It appears on tomb walls. And it appears on 5 of the vessels recovered from shaft M23. When the team led by biomolecular archaeologist Maxime Raggio and archaeologist Philip Stockhammer ran those 5 vessels through gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis, they were expecting to find myrrh. That was the translation. That was the consensus. That was what every major Egyptology textbook said anti-U meant. But that explanation has a problem. The chemistry said otherwise. Anti-U in every single vessel they analyzed was not myrrh. It was a manufactured compound, a blended mixture of coniferous oils and tars, primarily from cedar and juniper or cypress trees, combined with animal fats. The embalmers had made it themselves. They had cooked it down, combined it deliberately, and they labeled it with a word that scholars had been misdefining since the 1800s. Not similar to myrrh, not inspired by it, not a regional variant of it. A completely different substance. And when you understand what anti-U actually was, something fundamental shifts. Because the ancient Egyptian texts that describe mummification rituals, the papyri, the medical documents, the sacred rites, all of them reference anti-U by name. All of them have been translated using the word myrrh, and all of those translations are now, at minimum, incomplete. The priesthoods, who wrote about the sacred preparation of the body, were describing a chemical procedure, not a spiritual act. The recipe was right there the whole time. It was the vocabulary that was wrong. But the anti-U problem is only the first layer. The vessels also contained a second substance, sifet, another ancient Egyptian word that had been loosely translated for decades as a sacred oil. Scholars assumed it was a perfumed fat, probably a simple ritual compound. For decades, scholars dismissed it as symbolic, a ceremonial anointing oil with no precise recipe attached. Then, modern science found something that changed everything. Gas chromatography revealed sifet as a carefully engineered, fat-based unguent, loaded with plant additives selected for specific chemical properties. It was not symbolic. It was not vague. It was precise. The people who made sifet understood what each plant additive contributed to the final compound. They were not guessing. They were recording. And the use instructions on the vessels matched the chemistry. The jar labeled to put on his head contained mixtures specifically optimized for treating the face and skull, including castor oil and pistachio resin, both of which have antimicrobial properties. The jars labeled for the bandages contained different compounds entirely: beeswax, elemi resin, conifer derivatives, substances designed to seal wrapping cloth against moisture and microbial growth. These were not random. The formula for the head was different from the formula for the torso, was different from the formula for the bandages, was different from the formula used in the lower burial shaft. Each body part received a targeted chemical application. Each mixture was designed with a specific preservation goal in mind. This was not religion. This was pharmaceutical chemistry. Not a myth, not a metaphor, not a ritual approximation. A documented industrial process operating at a level of biochemical precision that history books have consistently undersold for a very long time. Now, here is where the story stops being about mummies. When the research team cross-referenced their chemical findings with known plant sources, two substances came back with no ordinary explanation: elemeli resin and dammar resin. Elemeni resin derives from trees in the genus Canarium. Canarium species grow in tropical forests across Africa and Asia. But here's the critical detail: the specific elemi signature found in 43% of the Saqqara vessels. That chemical profile is consistent with Southeast Asian Canarium species. Not African, Southeast Asian, and dammar resin is even more specific. Dammar comes from trees in the family Dipterocarpaceae. Those trees grow exclusively in Southeast Asian tropical forests. Not Africa, not the Mediterranean, not Arabia. Southeast Asia. In the 7th century BCE, an Egyptian embalming workshop was routinely sourcing ingredients from trees that do not grow anywhere on the African continent. The published paper says it plainly. These substances indicate long-distance trade networks via the vivid Indo-Mediterranean trade routes. But read that again. An ingredient that grows only in Southeast Asian forests was sitting in a ceramic jar in a burial shaft at Saqqara in 664 BCE. Not once, not as a curiosity. In 43% of the vessels. This was not an accident. This was not a one-time import. This was a supply chain. And if that's true, If the embalmers of Saqqara were routinely receiving tropical resin from Indonesia or coastal Southeast Asia almost 2,700 years ago, it means our history is missing a chapter. Because that kind of consistent high-volume import requires ships, it requires merchants, it requires ports, intermediaries, currency or barter systems, and a reliable return route. It requires a maritime network between the ancient Mediterranean and Southeast Asia that most historians consider speculative for that era. And yet, the chemistry is not speculative. The elemi resin is sitting in a Cairo archive right now. The Dammer fingerprint is published in Nature, volume 614, pages 287 through 293. It is real. It happened. The question is not whether the trade existed. The question is how far back it goes, and what else was moving along those routes that we do not yet know about. Here is where the institutional silence becomes its own kind of evidence. The paper was published, the findings were peer-reviewed, and then, quietly, very little changed. Walk into almost any major museum today that displays an Egyptian mummy or an embalming exhibit. Look at the label for anti-U. There is a very good chance it still says myrrh or incense. The correction, the molecular correction, confirmed by laboratory analysis published in one of the world's most respected scientific journals, has not yet reached the glass case. The placards have not been updated. The tour guides have not been retrained. The narrative that generations of Egyptologists built around the sacred vocabulary of mummification has not been formally revised. The researchers published their findings, and the field largely moved on. There was no dramatic suppression here. No files vanished. No expeditions were shut down. But there is something almost more unsettling about a silence that comes not from conspiracy, but from institutional inertia. From the simple, grinding difficulty of getting a field to admit that a word it thought it understood for 150 years has been mistranslated. It was sealed in assumption. It was mapped by consensus. And then the chemistry arrived and the consensus did not move. Now, does any of this prove the most extreme version of the story? Probably not. The Southeast Asian trade routes of the ancient world are not entirely unknown to archaeology. We have evidence of maritime connections between the Indian subcontinent, Arabia, East Africa, and Southeast Asia going back several thousand years. The trade routes were real. Historians have simply argued about the dates, the regularity, and the reach. The Saqqara findings do not require us to invent a lost civilization or a secret maritime empire. What they require is something more uncomfortable for mainstream scholarship, that we have been consistently underestimating the range and sophistication of ancient trade networks. The conservative explanation is still extraordinary. Egypt importing tropical resins from thousands of miles away on a routine basis in the 7th century BCE for a biochemically precise industrial process that we only now, in 2023, have the technology to fully understand. That is not an ordinary discovery, even stripped of speculation. But here is what the discovery would mean if we follow the thread. If Egyptian embalmers had established reliable access to damar and elemi resins, ingredients available only from Southeast Asian forests, then those resins had to pass through multiple hands to reach the Nile. Arabian ports, Indian traders, coastal intermediaries. Each link in that chain implies a level of maritime infrastructure, commercial organization, and cross-cultural knowledge exchange that we have barely begun to map. And if the supply chain was sophisticated enough to move plant resins from Borneo or Sumatra to Saqqara, what else was moving along those routes? Spices, metals, textiles, people, ideas. What knowledge traveled back the other way, eastward, from the workshops of Egypt into the ports of the ancient Indian Ocean? We do not know. What we do know is that a sealed shaft in the desert near a 4,000-year-old pyramid held a set of ceramic jars packed with substances from the opposite end of the known world. That the labels on those jars were practical instructions, not prayers. That the chemistry inside them was precise, intentional, and biochemically sophisticated. That a word scholars had been translating for a century and a half turned out to mean something entirely different. And that the ingredient which grew only in Southeast Asian tropical forests was sitting in 43% of the recovered vessels, not as a rarity, but as a standard component of an industrial process. Shaft M23II is still being studied. The embalming workshop at Saqqara is still being excavated. The deeper levels of the complex, the wabbit, the subterranean preparation chambers, have not been fully explored. There are more vessels to analyze, more labels to decode, more chemical signatures to match against plant databases that are themselves still being built. The workshop is still there. The chemistry is still waiting to be read. And somewhere at the far end of the supply chain that kept those jars stocked, there is a port or a trade route or a ship or a ledger, something that tells us exactly how a resin that grows only in the forests of Southeast Asia ended up inside a ceramic jar sealed into the desert sand of Egypt 2,600 years ago. We have not found it yet. The bowl is still in the archive, the residue is still on its walls, and the answer is still somewhere on the other side of an ocean that apparently the ancient world crossed more easily than we ever thought. If this kind of discovery unsettles your understanding of history the way it does mine, like and subscribe. There is more where this came from. The next video you need to watch is right on screen now.